Last year, KCI launched a call for input for guidelines and policy frameworks to promote just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work and quality jobs, to which you responded, you meaning climate strategies, responded by submitting your country-specific works, some even sector-specific, that provide policy recommendations on how these countries can achieve a just transition. Based on these works, tell us the state of play of countries in the undertaking of the transition. Have any countries established a clear plan, strategy, guidelines, or framework to guide them in their transition in order to do it in a just manner that addresses the impacts of the transition on the society and workforce? So the floor is yours.
Thank you for the question and for the invitation to join this panel. And I think you started looking into this question a little bit actually in your introduction. It looks like a very easy or straightforward question to answer, but actually it is not. And I think it links to what Jorian was saying earlier about different countries having different visions of just transition. So when we think about like actual just transition frameworks or policies that are, sorry, it's a little bit far away. When we think about actual just transition frameworks or policies that are very comprehensive, there are only a handful of countries that have actually implemented such kinds of instruments. And I could point, for example, well, Angelica from Argentina was mentioning about their example a little bit earlier. I'm sorry, from Chile was, I thought Angelica, Argentina. From Chile was talking about her example earlier. We see other countries that have similar plans. For example, in Costa Rica, we know that the just transition is really, really important. It's mentioned over 100 times in their NDCs, and they have a strong focus on skilling, reskilling, training for specifically oriented towards vulnerable populations that are not currently included in the labor markets. We know in South Africa, for example, that there is also a just transition framework. That was one of the first tasks that the Presidential Climate Change Commission has to tackle with. And we know, for example, that in the case of Colombia, the NDC included also the creation of 2 just transition frameworks, was one of them specifically for the workforce and one for energy. I haven't been able to corroborate this, but we heard from some of our sources that the one about the workforce has recently been approved. Again, this is not information that is available online, so this may be wrong, but if it's not already approved, it's very, very close to be approved. Other than that, we have seen the integration of just transitions within instruments, maybe not as a whole instrument or policy framework, but there has been now a better understanding of what just transition means. And even if you don't have just transition per se in those documents, we see pieces here and there, guidelines and principles that are introduced in other policies. And in that sense, for example, we see this within the NDCs. Again, Chile is one of these examples, but we also have, again, Colombia, Norway, the UK, Indonesia, Argentina, Kenya, Vietnam, all of which have mentioned the NDCs to some extent. And there is really good piece of work and research that is going to be coming out, produced by WBA and IISD, for example, that is going to map some of these examples. And finally, just to make things even more complicated, we know that some of the countries actually include these into other instruments. When we think about the workforce per se, we can mention examples, for example, in some of the countries that we have worked, like in Ghana, in Bangladesh, or Malawi, where we see really the focus on green jobs, on transition of the workforce, skilling, reskilling, even if they don't mention the just transition per se. So it's not a straightforward question, but what we can say is that we have seen progress in really owning the concept or the principles of the just transition in some of these countries, and really increasing the understanding of how they can benefit by introducing them into the policies.
Now I'll give the floor to Adriana, and if you could also answer Ailo's question would be great, and reflect on what you have heard so far.
Absolutely, and thank you for the space. First of all, I just want to make a disclaimer that I'm not here to speak on behalf of any country. Actually, all of the answers that I'm going to be providing come from research that we conduct in partnership with in-country researchers and partners. So just wanted to be clear on that. I think in the different studies that are part of the submission that we made to the KCI, there are a few lessons that I can highlight in terms of how to move from the theory or the policies to implementation. There are many roadblocks and challenges that I could mention. I will focus this answer on 3, which I would say are kind of the big 3 lacks. So basically lack of data, lack of institutional capacity, and lack of finance. This is not surprising for most of you, but maybe just to kind of give a little bit more of content here. When we think about the lack of data, we mentioned the lack of vision, which needs to be co-created, as something that has been mentioned by other panelists already. But we also know that even before thinking about finance, we really need to understand what is it that we need to achieve and how much is that going to cost. And that data is not available for most countries, especially in the Global South. And when it is very high level, so mostly at national level, while we know that the just transitions actually take place at local level. So the first thing that needs to happen is really translate that data to the local level before even thinking about those plans or the implementation of those plans, as I was saying, with a deep and very genuine stakeholder engagement process that needs to take place there. There are a few things that we need, or barriers and challenges that we need to overcome in the context of developing countries. In particular, the informality of the workforce really makes it difficult to collect the data that is needed to achieve an effective policy-making processes. And I can give an example from Colombia, for instance, where we know is a country that has like 50 to 60% informality in the workforce. They have mapped already some of the sectors that are going to be more affected, like fossil fuels, mining, transport, agriculture, and livestock. We know that the agriculture and livestock sector is going to absorb a lot of the job losses, so it may end up that at the end of the just transition implementation, there is going to be a net zero loss job. But what happens is that the informality is a lot higher in this sector, while in the fossil fuel and mining sector or the transport sector, there is more formality. And if there are no policies that can tackle those structural challenges of the labor market, what we do is basically creating more or reducing the quality of the jobs, even if we still have the jobs available. So all of these really important and real challenges of developing countries need to be taken into consideration. In terms of institutional capacity, a lot of the countries where we have conducted research lack institutional capacity and structures and processes for cross-ministerial coordination. And in some countries, like in the case of Argentina, for instance, what we have seen is that there is also competition between the ministries. So who is responsible for the biggest chunk of the global greenhouse gas emissions reductions? And where there is this competition and there is no coordination, there is no progress, basically. So these implementation agencies, like the one Angelica was mentioning, are super important, and it is really important they also have enough power to mandate the other ministries and to track and monitor progress. The last thing I'm going to say here in terms of governance, which is very important for implementation in the interest of time, because I could be speaking here for 2 hours on this, is that it really needs to be top-down and bottom-up. And the just transition mechanism that Annela was mentioning earlier is a really good example of how this can happen. You have an overarching framework. You have a fund, the Just Transition Fund, but you have territorial just transition plans that are created by the member states that are based on their specific priorities and needs. It has to be approved by the European Commission, so you still need to comply with the targets and the national plans, but they are informed by the local populations and the vulnerable regions. Also supported by the Just Transition platform to support the stakeholder engagement and technical assistance, etc. It is not perfect, but one thing that I would say is that one of the main questions we get all the time is, okay, how do we do this? Where are the case studies? Who can tell us how do we achieve this? Similar to the question that our colleague from Maldives was asking. The truth is that we have never undergone a transition like this, so case studies are very specific. We don't really have comprehensive answers, and we need to be open to experiment and to really create these pilots of how we can go about the transition and take those risks as well.